I went hunting alone that October, back in 2017. I was 32 then, and it was my first solo hunting trip in almost 6 years. I'd been busy with work, city noise, and endless traffic, and I missed the quiet. I picked a spot in northern Montana, near a place called Swan Creek. The land stretched wide and cold, covered in yellow pine and fir, with hills that rolled into thick forest. It was remote enough that I didn't expect to see anyone else. That was exactly what I wanted. I drove my old Ford up a dirt road until the tires started to slip on the soft mud. I parked near a clearing, unloaded my gear, and walked deeper into the woods until I found a flat spot near a small stream. The sound of water moving over stones was steady, almost calming. The air was sharp, dry, and the light came down through the trees like thin golden lines. Felt perfect. By evening, I had the tent up, a small fire going, and a piece of jerky in my hand. I was relaxed in a way I hadn't been for months. The forest had that kind of quiet that presses against your ears, where every small crack or rustle seems amplified. I remember thinking how alive the silence felt out there. The first night went easy. I woke once to the sound of something moving near the stream, maybe a deer or raccoon. The next morning, I started my hike before sunrise. My rifle hung across my shoulder, and I moved carefully through the brush, scanning the slopes. I saw a few elk tracks, but nothing else. Around noon, I noticed something odd. A tree stump that had deep cuts in it, almost like someone had been hacking at it with a hatchet, but the marks were too fresh and uneven. I figured someone else had been camping nearby. Still, I hadn't seen another truck or person since I'd arrived. By afternoon, the wind started to pick up. The forest made that low, moaning sound when the gusts pushed through. I decided to head back before it got dark. My boots were heavy with dirt, and my back ached from the weight of my pack. When I reached camp, I noticed something that stopped me cold. One of the stakes from my tent was out of the ground, and part of the canvas was loose. It wasn't torn, just unhooked, like someone had undone it. I crouched and checked the area. The ground was soft, but I didn't see any clear footprints, just some scattered pine needles and disturbed soil. I told myself it must have been the wind. The weather had been shifting all day, and maybe a gust had pulled it loose. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as the daylight faded behind the trees. That night, I built the fire higher than before. The forest felt different, like it was holding its breath. Every few minutes, I'd hear a snap of a twig or the shuffle of leaves. Animals, I told myself again. There were plenty of them here. But then, a sound came that didn't fit. Something like a low cough, followed by the faint creak of movement, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. I froze. It came again, slow and quiet, but steady. Person's cough, not an animal. It stopped after a few seconds, and I sat there, staring into the darkness, the fire throwing flickering shadows across the trees. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. I kept my rifle next to me, safety off. The cold air seeped through the fabric of my sleeping bag, and I stayed awake until dawn broke in gray light. The next morning, I felt drained and uneasy, but I told myself to shake it off. I'd come here to hunt, not to scare myself. I followed the ridge eastward, hoping to find better tracks. Around mid-morning, I saw smoke in the distance. Not far, maybe half a mile north. I stopped and looked through my binoculars. Through the trees, I could make out a thin column of smoke rising straight up, pale against the blue sky. Someone else was out here after all. I hesitated for a while, trying to decide if I should go check it out or stay put. It wasn't unusual for hunters to camp near each other, but something about that thin line of smoke made me uneasy. I decided to stay on my side of the ridge. I hunted a few more hours, got nothing, and headed back by late afternoon. When I reached my camp, the fire pit was cold, and the air felt heavier than before. Then I saw it. One of my gear bags had been dragged a few feet from where I'd left it. The zipper was open. Inside, some of my food was missing: jerky, a few protein bars, and one of my water bottles. The rest was untouched. It didn't look like an animal had torn through it. Everything was opened cleanly, like by hand. A tight chill went through my chest. I stood there, listening. Nothing but wind and the sound of the stream. I looked for footprints again, but only saw scattered mud and small indentations, too shallow to tell if they were boots or just erosion. I thought about leaving that night, but it was getting dark, and the road would be a nightmare in the dark. I decided to stay one more night and leave at first light. I made no fire that evening. I sat in the dark, my back against a tree, watching the outline of my tent through the dim light of the moon. The forest moved around me. Branches creaked, leaves whispered. But beneath it all, I started to hear something else. Slow steps, not steady like an animal, but deliberate. Crunch, pause, crunch. They were faint but clear. I held my breath and gripped the rifle across my lap. The steps came closer, maybe 20 yards away, maybe less. Then they stopped. The silence stretched so long I started to think I'd imagined it. Then came the sound again, something brushing against the fabric of my tent. Soft, slow. I didn't move. My chest felt like it was being squeezed. I waited, listening. A shadow moved across the tent, tall and thin. Paused there, perfectly still. Then the shape turned, and I heard soft movement fading away into the woods. I sat there until the first light touched the trees. When the sun rose, I packed fast. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped one of the tent poles. I didn't stop to eat, didn't even take down the fire pit. I threw everything into my pack and started walking fast toward the truck. Half a mile from camp, I found something that froze me where I stood. On the trunk of a tree near the trail, someone had carved a small X with a knife. It was fresh, the wood beneath still pale and raw. I looked around. Another X was carved into another tree about 20 yards farther down. Then another. A trail of them, leading roughly in the same direction I was heading. I forced myself to keep walking. The forest felt like it was closing in tighter with each step. My mind kept spinning. What if someone had been watching me since that first night? What if they'd marked where I'd been or where I was going? When I reached the clearing, I saw my truck right where I left it, but the driver's side door was open. My stomach dropped. I knew I had locked it. The seat was pushed back, and my glove box was open. Nothing was stolen, but everything had been searched. Maps, papers, even the flashlight. Whoever it was, they'd gone through my things and left it like that on purpose. I didn't wait. I started the engine, floored the gas, and didn't look back. I drove until I hit the highway and didn't stop until I reached a motel an hour south. When I finally parked, I sat in the lot for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it. There was no reason for anyone to be that deep in the woods, and no reason for someone to mess with me unless they wanted me gone, or worse. I never went back to that area again. A few weeks later, I read online about an old hermit who had been living off the grid somewhere in those mountains, breaking into camps for food and supplies. Some hunters claimed they'd found their camps disturbed too. Tents moved, food missing. Nobody ever caught him. Sometimes I still think about that shadow outside my tent, how long it stood there before walking away. Maybe he decided I wasn't worth the trouble, or maybe he was just waiting for me to fall asleep. Either way, I never camped alone again. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through southern France. I was 26, had been working non-stop for months, and I just wanted a break. Something quiet, away from people, away from the usual noise. I rented a small car in Marseille and drove out toward a forested area near a small village called Saint-Laurent-du-Verdon. The plan was simple: spend a few nights in nature, hike during the day, and clear my head before heading back to my job in Lyon. The drive there was peaceful. The roads were narrow, winding through farmland and small hills covered with thick pine and oak trees. By late afternoon, I found a small dirt path leading deeper into the woods, far enough from the village that I wouldn't run into anyone. It wasn't an official campsite, but it was flat, dry, and near a small stream that trickled through the rocks. I parked my car on the edge of the path, carried my tent and gear about 50 meters in, and set everything up before sunset. That first evening was perfect. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sound of the stream mixed with the soft hum of crickets. I cooked a simple meal on my small gas stove, ate while watching the last bit of orange light fade between the trees, and then sat for a while just listening to the forest. It felt calm, the kind of calm that makes you forget the rest of the world exists. When it got dark, I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped up the tent, and fell asleep faster than I expected. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. I couldn't tell what time it was. My phone was turned off to save battery, and my watch was buried in my backpack. What woke me wasn't a sound, but a feeling. You know that heavy silence when your body just knows something's off? The forest wasn't making any noise. No wind, no crickets, nothing. I listened for a long time, eyes open in the dark, but heard only the faint movement of water from the stream. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. The quiet of the night could have been anything. Maybe the temperature dropped and the insects went silent. I spent the day hiking along a trail that went up a low ridge overlooking the valley. I didn't see anyone the whole time. No campers, no hikers. Just one small farmhouse in the distance, maybe a few kilometers away. When I came back to my site, the sun was already dropping behind the trees. That evening, I noticed something strange. Across the stream on the opposite side, there was what looked like an old fire pit, just a small ring of blackened stones and ash. I hadn't seen it the day before. Maybe I missed it. It looked like it hadn't been used in a while, but the ashes still looked dark, not bleached out like old ones. I remember staring at it for a while, wondering if someone else had camped nearby recently. When it got dark again, I built a small fire of my own, read a bit, and then went to sleep. I woke up again around 2 or 3 in the morning. This time it wasn't silence that woke me. It was a noise, footsteps, slow, uneven steps on dry leaves. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a boar, but the sound wasn't right. It was too steady, too slow, and it stopped and started like someone walking carefully, trying not to make noise. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The sound came from across the stream. I could tell by the crunch of twigs and the faint rustle of brush. Then it stopped. For a long time, nothing moved. Then I heard the sound again, a single step and then another, this time closer. I didn't move for maybe 10 minutes. The air felt heavy, my chest tight. I finally unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. The moon was bright enough to see the clearing. First, I saw nothing. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw something standing near the old fire pit across the stream. It was a man. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark jacket or coat. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing my direction. I couldn't make out his face, but I could see that his posture was strange. Not quite relaxed, not quite stiff. He just stood there, completely still, like he was listening. I froze. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. My first thought was that maybe he was another camper, but something about it felt wrong. He had no light, no gear, nothing. Just standing there in the dark woods, staring. I watched him for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then he turned slowly and walked back into the trees, vanishing behind the darkness. I didn't sleep after that. I sat inside my tent with my flashlight in my hand until the sky started to turn pale gray. When morning came, I packed my things fast. The ground near the stream was damp, and I could see faint footprints in the mud, large, boot-shaped prints that led from the opposite bank toward the trees. They were fresh. I thought about leaving right then, but a part of me told myself I might be overreacting. Maybe it really was another hiker passing through. So I decided to stay one more night, but move my tent a bit farther back from the stream, near a denser patch of trees. That day felt off from the start. The forest was too quiet. The sun was out, but it felt cold in the shade. Around noon, I went to collect some firewood deeper in the forest. That's when I found something that made my stomach twist. A piece of fabric caught on a low branch, dark green and torn, like part of a jacket. It looked old and dirty. A few meters away, there was a crushed tin can and what looked like the remains of a sleeping bag, shredded and rotting. I turned around and walked straight back to camp. I didn't even collect the wood. When the sun began to set, I sat by my tent with my small fire burning, trying to calm myself down. I kept telling myself I'd leave first thing in the morning. The moment it got dark, I zipped myself inside the tent and stayed completely still. Sometime after midnight, I heard movement again. Slow steps, this time on my side of the stream. I held my breath. The steps got closer, and then I heard something brush against my tent. The sound of fabric dragging lightly. I could see the faint shadow of a figure through the thin material of the tent wall. Someone was standing right outside. I didn't move. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, shallow and steady. Then, after what felt like forever, the shadow moved away. I waited until I couldn't hear anything at all. At dawn, I packed up in less than 5 minutes. I didn't even bother to fold the tent properly. Just stuffed it into the trunk and drove off. I didn't look back until I was back on the main road. When I stopped for gas in the village, the woman at the counter noticed how shaken I looked. I told her I had been camping nearby and had seen someone in the woods at night. Her face went still. She said something quickly in French to the man behind the counter, and he shook his head. Then she told me in broken English that a man had gone missing in those woods 2 years earlier. A local. They never found him. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, paid for the gas, and drove away. For a long time after that trip, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The man by the stream, the shadow outside my tent, the torn fabric in the trees. I still don't know who he was or what he was doing out there, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that tall, motionless shape standing in the moonlight, watching from across the water. And every time I think about camping again, I remember how quiet the forest was that night. How completely silent it became right before he appeared. It was in late September of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip to Northern Oregon. I had been working nonstop for months, and I just wanted a few days away from everything. No phone, no people, no noise. I picked a small, less-known forest area near Mount Hood, not too far from a lake I found online. It looked peaceful, the kind of place where no one would bother me. I drove up early that morning, the air getting colder the higher I went. The road narrowed into a single lane lined with tall pines that leaned slightly inward, like they were watching. I had my old gray tent packed, some food, a sleeping bag, a small camping stove, and a flashlight that flickered if I shook it too hard. It wasn't fancy gear, but it had always done the job. When I got there, the place was dead silent. Not the kind of quiet you get in parks. This was different. No distant cars, no planes, no wind. Just stillness. I found a flat clearing near the tree line and set up camp. The sun filtered through the branches, the smell of pine needles thick in the air. I boiled some coffee, unpacked my folding chair, and watched the lake. Everything looked perfect. By late afternoon, I decided to explore a little deeper into the woods. I followed a trail that was barely visible, more like a faded path people had once used. The ground was soft and damp, and I noticed the air getting cooler the further I went in. After maybe 20 minutes, I saw something strange. A small circle of rocks that looked placed, not natural. Inside the circle were a few burned logs, some half-melted beer cans, and a broken bottle. It looked like someone had camped there not too long ago. I didn't think much of it and kept walking. About 50 yards from that spot, I started noticing trash. Torn food wrappers, a ripped shirt, an old sleeping bag covered in dirt. The smell of something sour hung around. I stopped when I saw what looked like a pair of boots half buried in leaves. They were muddy, and one was tipped on its side, as if someone had left in a hurry. That was when I got this weird feeling in my chest. That tight, heavy kind of pressure that makes you feel watched. I turned around and decided to head back. I didn't want to get lost before dark. When I got back to my tent, the sun was already dropping behind the trees, the sky fading to orange. I cooked a small dinner, sat by the lake, and tried to shake off that strange feeling. I told myself it was probably just leftovers from someone's old campsite. By around 9 p.m., the temperature dropped fast. I zipped up my tent and got into my sleeping bag. I remember listening to the faint sound of water hitting the shore, soft and slow. But just when I started to drift off, I heard something. A snapping sound, like a twig breaking, came from somewhere behind my tent. I froze, holding my breath. Could have been an animal, deer, raccoon, maybe even a fox. I listened. Nothing. Then, another sound, heavier this time. A crunch like a boot pressing into dry ground. I felt my pulse in my neck. I turned off my small lantern, trying not to make a sound. The air felt heavier, colder. I lay still, waiting. A few minutes passed, and then I heard it again. Closer. Slow steps circling the tent. One step, then another. Soft, steady, deliberate. Not animal movement. Human. I could tell by the rhythm. I stared at the tent wall, seeing the faint shape of a shadow moving past. My breathing was so shallow I could barely hear it myself. Then, nothing. The sound stopped. I waited. 10 minutes, maybe. My whole body was tense. I was sure someone was out there. But when I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the tent a little and peek out, the woods looked empty. My flashlight flickered again, weak and unreliable. I scanned the area, nothing. Just darkness and trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound made me jump. I sat there, clutching my flashlight, waiting for daylight. When morning came, everything looked normal again. Birds were out, the sun cut through the mist, and it almost felt stupid to have been that scared. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and looked around. That's when I noticed something off near the trees. There were footprints, not animal ones, human. They went around my tent in a half circle, just like I'd imagined. The soil was soft, so the impressions were clear, deep enough to tell the person had been wearing heavy boots. They led toward the woods, but didn't come from the trail I'd used. It was like they appeared from deeper in the forest. My stomach sank. I packed my stuff quickly. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I wanted to leave, but part of me wanted to see where those prints went, just to understand what the hell that person was doing out there in the middle of nowhere. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The trail went about 200 yards into the woods and then turned sharply to the right. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks sticking out everywhere. After a few minutes, I came to another small clearing. And that's when I saw it, another tent. It looked old, dirty, and torn along the side. Next to it was a pile of trash. Empty cans, a rusted pan, scraps of fabric. The smell was strong, like something rotten. The tent flap was open, and I could see a sleeping bag inside that was stained dark brown near the edge. There was a small backpack leaning against a tree, half unzipped. I didn't go closer. Something about the whole thing felt wrong, like I was looking at a place someone wasn't supposed to find. That pressure in my chest came back, worse than before. I turned around fast, and that's when I saw movement behind one of the trees. Just a small shift, like someone pulling back. I froze. My heart jumped into my throat. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I turned and ran back toward my camp as fast as I could, tripping over roots, my bag bouncing against my shoulder. When I got back to my tent, I grabbed everything I could, threw it into my car, and started driving before I even buckled my seatbelt. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the keys. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station about 40 minutes away. I sat there in the parking lot for a long time, just breathing. The station clerk came out at one point, probably wondering why I looked so messed up. I didn't explain. I just told myself it was done, that I was fine now. A few days later, back home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I looked up reports from that area, missing hikers, strange activity, anything. I found a short article about a man who had been living off-grid in the woods near Mount Hood for years. Locals said he avoided people, stole food, and sometimes camped near the lake. There were a few reports of hikers spotting him from a distance, tall, scruffy, always wearing dark clothes. The article mentioned that rangers had tried to find him but never did. I don't know if it was him. I'll never know. But I keep thinking about those footprints around my tent. How close they came. How long that person must have stood there in the dark while I lay still, pretending to sleep. Since that night, I haven't gone camping again. I still like the woods. I drive past them sometimes, but I can't stand the thought of sleeping out there alone, because when I close my eyes, I still hear those slow, heavy steps circling my tent, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had made one wrong sound. It was late September 2013. The air had started to cool down, and the forest near northern Idaho had that quiet, heavy feeling that comes right before winter sets in. I had been meaning to take a few days away from the noise of town, just to clear my head. I was 27 then, working nights at a warehouse, barely sleeping, and everything in life felt like a loop that wouldn't stop repeating. So, I packed up my old blue tent, my sleeping bag, a few cans of food, and my dad's hunting knife, and decided to camp near a place I had only heard about once. A small, overgrown area that used to be a family campsite in the 1980s. It had been closed for years after some kind of flooding destroyed part of the access road. I drove down dirt roads most of the way, my truck rattling over loose stones. After a while, the GPS gave up and I had to rely on an old printed map. The trees grew thicker as I went deeper, blocking out most of the sky. I passed a broken sign that said Larch Creek Campground, barely hanging on to its post. Everything beyond that point felt still, like the forest hadn't been touched in a long time. I parked near the edge of what used to be a parking lot, now covered in weeds and young trees, and carried my stuff down a narrow path that led toward the creek. The first thing that hit me was how silent everything was. No sounds of people, no hum of cars in the distance. Even the birds seemed rare. I found a clearing beside the creek where old picnic tables still sat, half collapsed and covered in moss. There were traces of fire pits, rusted cans, and broken bottles scattered around. Felt like time had stopped there. I set up my tent near a fallen log, facing the water, and gathered some dry wood. By late afternoon, the light was already dimming between the trees. I cooked a small meal over the fire and watched the smoke drift into the dark. The creek sounded steady like a soft background hum. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the tree line. It's strange how, when you're alone that far out, even normal sounds feel off. A branch snapping, a leaf falling. It all hits harder. Around 9 p.m., I climbed into my tent. The forest was pitch black outside, the kind of darkness that eats the beam of a flashlight. I lay on my back, listening. The air had that damp chill that settles in your bones. I must have drifted in and out of sleep because I remember waking up to what I thought was footsteps. Slow, steady, moving somewhere near the creek. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I stayed quiet, just listening. The sound stopped after a few seconds, replaced by the creek again. I told myself it was nothing. Still, I couldn't fall back asleep easily after that. When I woke the next morning, the sun was bright but weak, barely cutting through the mist. I walked around the area just exploring. I found an old wooden structure a few minutes from my tent. It looked like a restroom building, but the roof had caved in, and vines crawled up the sides. There were bits of broken glass everywhere, and the smell of damp wood. Behind it, I found something stranger, a small trail that wasn't on the map. It looked like it had been used a long time ago. Out of curiosity, I followed it. The path wound through thick brush and climbed a small hill. It took me about 10 minutes to reach the top, and when I did, I found what looked like another clearing, but this one had something built in it. A small wooden cabin, or what was left of it. The windows were gone, the door barely hanging by one hinge. Inside, there were 2 rusted bed frames, an old table, and pieces of a metal stove. I noticed marks on the inside of the door, deep scratches, uneven, like someone had dragged something sharp across it again and again. It didn't look like animal damage. It looked deliberate. I stepped outside and circled the cabin. In the back, buried halfway in the ground, was what looked like a small trench, maybe an old storage pit. It smelled faintly sour, like something had been wet and sealed for too long. I didn't stay long there. The place made me uneasy in a way that's hard to explain. It wasn't fear exactly, but more like the air was heavier there, as if something about that spot didn't want people around anymore. I went back to camp and decided to stay one more night before heading home. I spent the afternoon fishing near the creek and reading. By sunset, I noticed the woods getting darker faster than before. The temperature dropped sharply. Around 8 p.m., I built another fire, bigger this time, and sat close to it. The woods felt alive that night, but not in a peaceful way. I started hearing sounds again, small ones at first. Twigs breaking, the faint crunch of footsteps that seemed to move and stop, always just beyond where I could see. I pointed my flashlight toward the trees several times, but the beam hit nothing but mist and branches. The forest around me felt like it was waiting. Every time I thought it was over, I'd hear another sound, a rustle, a quiet thud. Once I swore I saw a shape between the trees. Not clear, just the dark outline of something human-sized standing still. When I shined the light in that direction, it was gone. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. The woods play tricks like that, especially when you're alone. But later that night, I woke again inside my tent. The fire had died out. I could hear something moving slowly, close to where I kept my backpack. The sound of dirt shifting, something scraping lightly. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. I didn't want to unzip the tent. I just listened. After maybe a minute, the noise stopped. I waited longer before finally pulling the zipper just enough to peek out. There was no one there. The moonlight made everything pale and colorless. My backpack was where I left it, but one of the straps was torn loose, like it had been yanked. That's when I decided I wasn't staying another night. As soon as the first light appeared in the morning, I packed everything fast. I didn't even bother cooking breakfast. When I went to load the truck, I noticed something else. The driver's side mirror had been cracked clean down the middle. I hadn't hit anything. There were muddy fingerprints on the door handle, human-sized, but smeared. Driving out of there was the longest 2 hours of my life. I didn't look in the mirrors much. The forest seemed to close in tighter with every turn of the dirt road. When I finally reached the main highway, I pulled over and sat for a while, just breathing. Later, back in town, I looked up Larch Creek Campground online. I found an old forum post from someone who said their uncle used to camp there before it was shut down. He mentioned that after the flood, a man had stayed behind, living out there alone for years in one of the old cabins. No one ever found him after the forest reclaimed the area. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, but I've thought about it a lot since. The sounds, the broken strap, the fingerprints, it all fits too neatly. Someone was still out there. Maybe someone who never left after the place was abandoned. Someone who had been watching from the trees the whole time. It's been years now, but sometimes I still dream about that forest. The heavy silence, the mist, the faint crack of a twig somewhere too close to ignore. Every time I think about camping again, I remember that feeling of being watched, and I lose the urge completely. I don't think I'll ever go back out there. Some places are left behind for a reason. I had decided to go camping alone in the summer of 2017, somewhere deep in the forests of northern Idaho. I was 27 then, old enough to think I knew what I was doing and young enough to believe nothing bad could really happen to me. I'd been hiking and camping on and off for years, but always with friends or family. This trip was supposed to be different. I wanted quiet, no phones, no noise, no people. Just me, my tent, and the woods. I drove out early in the morning, taking old Forest Service roads that barely showed up on my map. The road grew narrower as I went, swallowed by thick pine and spruce trees. After 2 hours of bumping along gravel and dirt, I reached a clearing beside a small lake. The water was still, the kind of stillness that feels almost heavy. There were no other cars, no other signs of people. It was perfect, or at least I thought it was. I unpacked my tent, set it near the lake, and gathered wood for a fire. The air smelled like pine sap and wet earth. The ground was soft with layers of needles. I remember feeling calm in a way I hadn't in a long time. I cooked a simple meal on my little stove. Beans and rice, nothing fancy. And as the sun began to drop behind the trees, I sat by the fire and watched the light fade. The world around me grew darker, but not silent. Crickets chirped, something splashed lightly in the lake, and every now and then I could hear a faint crack of branches somewhere far in the woods. It was around 10 p.m. when I decided to go to sleep. The air had cooled down, and the night was darker than I'd expected. When I turned off my flashlight, the blackness was almost solid. I zipped myself into the sleeping bag and tried to let my thoughts drift, but sleep didn't come easily. I could hear things outside, twigs snapping, small movements. It's normal, I told myself. Animals, probably deer. I rolled over and forced my eyes shut. I must have dozed off for an hour or two because when I opened my eyes again, my phone said it was almost 1 a.m. The forest had gone quieter, and the fire was just a faint glow now. What woke me wasn't a sound. It was the feeling that something was off. The kind of feeling you can't explain but know in your gut. I stayed still for a moment, listening. The wind had stopped. I couldn't hear the crickets anymore. Then I heard it. A faint crunch of footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps, the sound of weight pressing down on damp soil. My heart began to pound. I froze completely, not daring to breathe too loudly. The steps came closer. They weren't animal steps, too heavy, too slow. They stopped right near the tent. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then I heard what sounded like someone exhaling. Just one slow breath. I couldn't see anything through the tent wall, only a faint outline from the dim moonlight outside. I didn't move. I just lay there, every muscle in my body tight. After maybe 30 seconds, the steps started again, moving away this time, back toward the trees. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat there, clutching my pocket knife, staring at the faint shape of the tent wall until the first gray light of morning crept in. When I finally got out, I saw footprints in the dirt about 10 feet from the tent. They weren't mine. They were larger boot prints. They came from the tree line, circled halfway around my campsite, then disappeared back the way they came. My first thought was that maybe it was a hunter or another camper, but there were no other campsites nearby, none that I'd seen for miles. I walked toward the tree line, following the prints until they became faint. They led in the general direction of the old logging road I'd driven down. Maybe someone had seen my truck and decided to take a look. That was the only explanation that made sense. Still, something about the careful, slow steps bothered me. It wasn't the way you'd walk if you were just passing by. I tried to shake it off. I cooked breakfast, packed up a bit, and decided I'd stay one more night. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone hiking through late at night. Nothing happened during the day. I fished a little, read a book, and by evening, the uneasiness started to fade. But that night, around the same time, close to 1 a.m., I woke up again. The fire was out, the forest quiet. I didn't hear footsteps this time. What I heard instead was a faint metallic clinking sound, like something tapping against metal. It came from the direction of the lake. I sat up, heart racing. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it through the tent window. For a second, I thought I saw movement near the trees, but it was too dark to be sure. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The night air hit me cold and still. I couldn't see much, but then my light caught something. A faint reflection near the ground, maybe 20 yards away. It looked like the glint of a metal object, maybe a can or a piece of gear. I stared for a while, but there was no movement. After a few minutes, I zipped the tent again and sat there, not sleeping, just waiting for the sun. When daylight came, I walked to the spot I'd seen the glint. There was nothing there. No can, no metal, just disturbed soil and boot prints again. This time, there were more of them, some leading right up behind where my tent was. That's when I decided I was done. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes. I was throwing stuff into the truck, not even caring about folding or cleaning. I just wanted to leave. As I was about to get in, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the side of a tree near my camp, someone had carved a mark into the bark. A small, crude X, cut fresh, the wood underneath still pale. I drove out fast, barely slowing for the rough patches on the road. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach the highway. I didn't stop until I was miles away, sitting at a gas station, hands still shaking as I tried to fill the tank. I looked back at my truck bed, at all the gear thrown around, and realized how lucky I probably was. That night, in a cheap motel, I kept thinking about that sound. The slow breathing, the footsteps, that clinking noise. I didn't imagine it. I know I didn't. Whoever that was had been standing right outside my tent, watching, listening, and the worst part was the realization that they hadn't done anything. Yet, they hadn't spoken, hadn't tried to take anything, hadn't shown themselves. They just wanted to remind me that I wasn't alone out there. A week later, I looked up reports from that area. Missing campers, hikers gone off the trail. There were a few over the past decade. Never solved. No suspects. No signs. I didn't read much more after that. I didn't want to know. I've gone camping since then, but never alone. I can still remember the sound of those footsteps, that breath just outside the thin wall of nylon. It's strange how something so simple can stay in your head. Sometimes, when I'm out in the woods with friends and the night gets quiet, that same feeling comes back. The air goes still, and I catch myself glancing toward the dark tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there, just barely visible between the trunks. I never went back to Idaho, and I never camp alone anymore. It was late October of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in northern Wyoming, near a place called Pine Hollow Ridge. I was 26 at the time, working construction jobs on and off, and I just wanted a break from the noise of people. I had done some camping before, but never alone for more than a night or two. This time, I planned for 3 nights, just me, my tent, and the quiet of the woods. The drive up there was slow and bumpy. The forest road twisted up through the pines, and by the time I parked near the old trailhead, it was close to sunset. The air was cold enough that every breath left a thin cloud. I hiked about 1.5 miles down a narrow path until I found a small clearing near a shallow creek. It looked perfect, flat ground, trees on all sides, and a decent distance from the main road. I could hear nothing but the soft trickle of water and the wind cutting through dry leaves. By the time I got the tent up, it was dark enough that I had to use my headlamp. I made a small fire using the wood I had gathered along the trail. The warmth felt good. I sat there eating from a can of beans, the smell of smoke in my clothes, and I remember thinking this was exactly what I needed: quiet, no phone service, no people. That first night was calm. The fire burned low until only embers were left. I crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the creak and the occasional crack of a branch. Forest sounds never bothered me much. I slept easily. The next morning, I woke up around 7. The ground was cold and damp from dew, and my tent had beads of moisture clinging to it. I boiled some water for instant coffee and walked down to the creek to wash my face. The water was freezing. There were small animal tracks by the bank, probably raccoon or fox. Everything smelled like wet pine. After breakfast, I hiked further upstream to see where the creek came from. About 1/2 mile up, I found an old, half-collapsed wooden bridge. It looked like no one had used it in decades. The boards were gray and splintered, and the handrails were long gone. On the other side of it was a faint path heading deeper into the woods, almost hidden under leaves and weeds. I didn't go far down it. Something about it felt off, not dangerous exactly, just forgotten. I went back to camp and spent most of the afternoon gathering wood and trying to fish with the small rod I had brought. I didn't catch anything. By evening, clouds started rolling in. The air grew heavy, and the forest got quiet. Too quiet. I remember noticing how the wind had stopped, like the whole place was holding its breath. That night it rained. Hard. The sound of the rain on the tent was constant, a steady drumbeat that made it hard to sleep. Water pooled around the edges of the tent, and I had to push some of it away with my boots. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like footsteps in the wet leaves, slow and irregular. I froze. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or even a bear. I kept still, listening. The sound came from behind my tent, near the creek. Then it stopped. For a long time, I lay there, waiting. The rain muffled everything. I told myself it was just my imagination or maybe water dripping from a branch. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. When I woke in the morning, the rain had stopped, but the ground was soaked. I stepped outside and checked around the tent. There were tracks in the mud, human tracks. Not boot prints like mine, but bare feet. They weren't huge, but they were clear enough to know they weren't from an animal. I stared at them for a long time. The prints came from the direction of the creek and stopped about 10 feet from my tent. Then they turned back the same way. I didn't know what to think. Maybe someone was wandering out here, maybe a hiker who got lost. Still, it bothered me. I decided to stay close to camp that day just in case. I gathered more wood, checked my gear, and kept my hatchet close by. All day, the woods felt different, quieter, heavier. The sun barely broke through the clouds, and I felt like someone was watching me. Every time I turned, there was nothing there, just trees and dripping branches. By evening, I had made up my mind to leave early the next morning. I packed up most of my stuff so I could head out quickly. I made a small fire before dark, just enough to stay warm. I sat there watching the smoke twist upward into the dim light, my nerves tight. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound that still makes my stomach twist when I think about it. Fabric tearing. It was faint but close, maybe a few feet away. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, shaking in my hand. Right outside my tent, near the fire pit, I saw movement. Someone crouching low, turning fast when the light hit them. I only caught a glimpse. Pale skin, dark, wet hair clinging to their face, clothes torn and filthy. Then they bolted toward the creek. I jumped out, my heart hammering. The rain had started again, light at first but growing harder by the second. I could hear splashing from the creek, then nothing but rain. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the flashlight. I didn't sleep after that. I sat awake until dawn, listening to every sound, every gust of wind. When light finally came, I packed what was left of my stuff and left most of my gear behind. The tent, the cooler, everything. I just wanted out of there. The trail back to the car felt twice as long as before. My clothes were soaked, boots heavy with mud. When I reached the car, I looked back once. The ridge hidden behind trees, silent again. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station about 40 miles away. I sat in the parking lot, still breathing hard, staring at my muddy hands. Later that day, I called the local ranger station to report what I'd seen. They said they'd send someone out to check the area. A week later, a ranger called me back. He said they found signs of someone camping out illegally in the area, maybe a drifter or squatter. They found makeshift shelters, some old tools, and food wrappers near the creek, maybe half a mile from where I had been. He told me it wasn't the first report like that. People had mentioned strange noises or footprints, things going missing from campsites. He said whoever it was probably didn't mean harm, just living off the grid, surviving. But that didn't make it any less unnerving. I never went back there. Sometimes when it rains at night, I still think about those bare footprints outside my tent. I think about how quiet the woods were that day, how it felt like the forest was watching. Maybe it was just one person, someone lost or broken, living out there in the wet dark. But knowing how close they came, how they circled around me while I slept, that's what stays with me. And the worst part isn't that someone was there, just wondering how long they had been there before I noticed. It was late September 2011 when I decided to take a short solo camping trip out in the northern woods of Oregon. I'd been working too much that summer, barely seeing anything beyond my apartment walls, and I just needed quiet. No phone, no people, no noise. The weather forecast said there might be rain, but I didn't care. I liked the sound of rain in the woods. It made everything feel distant, tucked away from the world. I drove my old Ford Ranger down a narrow dirt road that seemed to have been forgotten years ago. The trees leaned inward, tall pines and dripping ferns pressing against the edges of the trail. I found a clearing about a mile off an old logging route, wide enough for my tent, my truck, and a small fire pit. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in layers of pine needles and old mud hardened from the summer heat. I set up my tent by a line of trees facing a shallow creek, where the water barely moved. By the time I finished, the clouds were already turning darker. The air had that heavy, electric feeling before rain, thick and cool, like it was waiting to break open. I got a small fire going and boiled water for instant noodles, sitting on an old camping stool and staring into the trees. The woods were quiet in that way that isn't peaceful, more like something was holding its breath. It started raining around 9. At first, just a light patter against the tarp, but it quickly turned heavy, loud enough that I couldn't even hear the creek anymore. The fire hissed and died down, leaving only a few glowing pieces of wood. I got inside the tent, zipped it up, and lay on my sleeping bag, listening. The sound of rain on nylon is comforting for a while, but when you're alone and deep in the woods, it starts to feel different. Every sound blends: raindrops, wind, branches, until you can't tell what's moving out there and what's not. I turned off my lantern to save the battery and lay in the dark, staring at the faint outline of the tent ceiling. The rain kept pounding, harder now. Water started pooling at the edges of the tent floor. I shifted around to find a dry spot, trying to ignore how cold it was getting. Sometime after midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't the rain, this was heavier, slower, like someone stepping through wet ground. I froze. My first thought was that it could be an animal, maybe a deer or an elk, but then it stopped. The rain drowned everything else, so it was hard to be sure. I stayed still, barely breathing, just listening. Then I heard it again, a slow drag, then a soft squish close to the tent. My chest tightened. I reached for the small hatchet I kept beside my sleeping bag. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The steps circled partway around the tent. Not quick, not panicked, just steady. Then silence again. The rain kept falling, but the sound of those steps seemed carved into the noise. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I opened my eyes, it was early morning, pale light leaking through the rain clouds. Everything was soaked. My tent was half collapsed from the weight of the water pooling on top. I got out slowly, gripping the hatchet, scanning the trees. There were footprints, faint but visible in the soft mud. They weren't animal tracks. They were boots, big ones. They came from the tree line, stopped right behind my tent, then turned back the way they came. I felt sick looking at them. There was no sign of another camp nearby, no car tracks, no signs of people. Whoever it was had walked here, in the middle of a storm, just to stand behind my tent. I wanted to believe it was nothing. Maybe a hiker passing through who saw my camp and didn't want to bother me. But no one hikes in that kind of rain at 2 in the morning, not miles off any real trail. I decided to pack up right then. My hands were shaking the whole time, not from the cold, but from the thought that whoever had come by could still be out there. The forest felt heavier that morning. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and mist rolled low through the trees, twisting between trunks like smoke. Every time I looked up, I thought I saw movement, just the flicker of something dark between the trees. When I got to the truck, I noticed something else. On the passenger side door, right above the handle, was a muddy handprint. Not smeared, not brushed, a full, deliberate handprint. I stood there staring at it, feeling my stomach drop. The print was huge, larger than mine by a lot, and it was fresh, the kind of wet mud that only could have stuck there during the night. Whoever it was, they'd come right up to my truck while I was asleep. Maybe they were checking if it was unlocked. Maybe they were waiting to see if I'd wake up. I started the engine and pulled out fast, the tires slipping in the wet dirt. The road back out seemed longer than it had the day before. Every curve looked the same, the trees crowding closer, the mud slick and deep. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking behind me. When I finally hit the paved road again, I pulled over near a gas station about 20 miles out and just sat there, staring at my hands on the steering wheel. I didn't even realize how cold I was until the heater started blowing warm air. I went inside, bought coffee, and tried to calm down. My reflection in the window looked pale and tired, like I hadn't slept in days. For a while, I tried to tell myself it was probably some lost hunter or someone curious who'd wandered too close. But that handprint, the way it was placed, the size of it, it didn't feel like an accident. Felt like someone testing something, testing how close they could get. When I got home, I washed the truck, but the mud in the handprint had left a faint outline even after scrubbing. I can still see it when the sun hits the door a certain way, a reminder of that night. I haven't gone camping alone since then. I still love the woods, But there's something different now when I think about being out there. I think about how easy it is for someone to find you when you think you're hidden, how small a tent really is between you and whatever walks through those trees in the dark. Sometimes, late at night when it rains, I still hear it in my head, that slow, heavy sound of footsteps circling outside. I'll never know who it was or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. They were close enough to touch the door, close enough to listen, and for whatever reason, they decided to leave. That's what haunts me the most. Not what happened that night, but the thought of what could have.